In this video, we'll transition from discussing ancient Greek philosophy to the birth of Christianity, so that way we can understand the influence of Christianity on philosophy in the Western world. It is impossible to understand Western and European philosophy without understanding Christianity. Before we do, let's pick up the intermediaries. Euclid, whose mathematical proofs form the foundation of geometry for 21 centuries. Imagine writing a text that remains accurate for 2 millennia. The Roman philosopher Seneca is a proponent of what's called Stoicism, the idea that destructive emotions come from ignorance and should therefore be controlled, and one should practice self-mastery. And he questioned the relationship between freedom, determinism, and the human will, what we could call volition or desire. But Stoicism, or being stoic, as the British might say, keeping a stiff upper lip, actually has so much in common with Greek cynicism that we don't need to discuss it separately. The most famous Stoic text is by the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and the text he authors titled The Meditations, which is certainly worthwhile. But between Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, Plato, and cynicism, we already understand what we need to understand about Stoicism. To be Stoic is to have equanimity, or an evenness of spirit in response to the ups and downs of life. In that sense, there's no reason to belabor the point further. The Roman religion modifies Greek religion, and a number of the deities are renamed. They become the various planets of our solar system. But we also have, during this time of the historical rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the very significant birth of Christianity, with a prophet named Jesus, who comes to be called the Christ, meaning anointed one, who preaches salvation and apocalyptic judgment. But he's one of many prophets, teachers, and religious and cultural leaders preaching a similar message. You likely already understand this if you're familiar with John the Baptist. In the text of the New Testament, John the Baptist is said to prepare the way for the message of Jesus, foreshadowing Jesus' message. But this message is also foreshadowed 1,000 years prior by Zoroastrian religion. Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, the prophet there, of a need for salvation, cosmic dualism, and a coming end to the world, or apocalypse. And we'll take special attention to the Essene movement. More on that in a moment. One of the other classes I commonly teach is called Introduction to the World's Religions. The textbook which I was given to use for that class contains the following paragraph: that when the Jews lived under foreign rule, Persian, Greek, Parthian, and then Roman, Judaism became somewhat open to cross-cultural religious borrowing. Concepts of Satan, the hierarchy of angels, reward or punishment in an afterlife, and the final resurrection of the body on the Day of Judgment are thought by some scholars to have made their way into Jewish belief from the Zoroastrianism of the Persian Empire. For these beliefs were absent from earlier Judaic religion. The author of the textbook which contains this paragraph, as a scholar and historian of the world's religions, is implicitly explaining what is very likely an evolution of the Christian metaphysic. That Christianity doesn't pop up from nowhere, that its ideas have precedent or forebearers. They evolve from earlier ideas in similar religions and cultures in nearby parts of the world. Judaism does not have any clear concept of the afterlife. Judaism is nearly unique in this regard. But Christianity absolutely does. Islam absolutely does. And importantly, ancient Babylonian monotheistic Zoroastrianism certainly does. What Mary Pat Fisher, the editor of this textbook, is attempting to explain is that when we look at the historical and archaeological record, what it looks like is that these ideas were borrowed from other cultures through a process of what we could call cultural transmission. The idea that Christianity evolved rather than sprung into existence as perfect and unique likely is also an uncomfortable idea. But that's what it is to study the history of ideas. And if we're lucky, to recognize the relationships between them. Under the Roman Emperor Constantine, the Roman Empire becomes the Holy Roman Empire. Constantine is said to have had a conversion experience in which he reports a claim of seeing 3 enormous crosses emblazoned in the sky above his army on the battlefield. And he interprets this as a sign from God that under the banner of Christianity, his Roman armies will be victorious. Not only is this the birth of the Holy Roman Empire and the mixture of religion and politics for thousands of years in the European world to come, a new religion into politics in this case, but contrasting from the message of Jesus, this represents a usage of Christianity for military purposes. Certainly, Judaism was used in the same regard. But to take the message of Jesus, the Prince of Peace, and turn it into a war slogan likely should strike us as counterintuitive. But let's get back to the origin before we get too deep into the development. In a set of texts referred to as the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find what are the Chronicles of Josephus, about an esoteric mystery cult beginning to thrive in Jerusalem, in Jewish communities, about 150 years before the traditional birth of Jesus. Josephus describes a male community that traditionally dressed in white to symbolize ritual purity, that believed in communal property and shunned wealth. This very closely parallels the type of community Jesus will advocate for. Male-dominated, as the Catholic priesthood still is to this day. Ritual purity, communal living and sharing. Think of the fishes and the loaves, and the shunning of wealth. Certainly, prior to Jesus's elaboration of these themes, they were already popping into existence in his community 100 or so years before his birth. Whether the relationship between this Essene cult within Judaism and Christianity is coincidental or causal, you'll have to determine for yourself. These Essenes prepared themselves for a cosmic battle in which the sons of light would be victorious over the sons of darkness and establish a reign of utmost purity centered in Jerusalem. This is remarkably similar or reminiscent of Zoroastrian cosmic dualism, and almost to a T foreshadows the message of Jesus, in which he too discusses the light and the darkness, the good and the evil, and at least seems to be prophesying just such a reign, that the Son of Man will come in glory and rule from Jerusalem. The people who hear Jesus appear to interpret this message as something to happen soon. But over time, this becomes developed as something that will happen at some point in an apocalyptic or rapturous future, with an creation of a new covenant through which Jesus will ultimately rule from a throne on earth. But those things will develop in even more explicit detail over time. Pay special attention and keep in mind this bit about traditional white garb, as it will reemerge. There are a number of verses which characterize the Christian ethic, culture most broadly, and metaphysic, its beliefs about what constitutes reality. There are traditional interpretations of these verses that you may be familiar with. In order to understand the ethic that Christianity provides, I found these verses to be emblematic or archetypal. In order to understand what Christian philosophy wants from people, you may be familiar with John 14:6, which states that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father but by me. The most common interpretation of this verse is that Christianity is therefore the one true religion, and that all other religions are false. The effect of that idea on world history is extremely significant. But what I would like to do is take a second analysis of these well-known verses in order to determine if there are any other possible interpretations. The reason why I feel this is justified, and I'm arguing it's appropriate, is that Jesus is a sort of mystic, and he speaks in riddles and parables. Even the people who hear him face to face don't seem to fully grasp what he's intending. So if Jesus' own disciples don't always get it, it would likely be conceited if we think we've got the only possible right interpretation. And certainly, as Christianity develops, interpretation and different interpretations becomes very important. While this verse may mean that there's only one true religion and every other one is false, it might mean that no man comes to the Father but by being like me, that is, by being Christian, following in the footsteps of Christ. I will argue now that the defining characteristics of following Christ would likely be loving your neighbor, turning the other cheek, and offering mercy and forgiveness. Those seem to be the primary elements of Jesus' philosophy. Love and forgiveness. If that's what's required to attain divine communion, likely it could be achieved through any variety of religions. But certainly that's not the most common interpretation. Matthew 28:19 and other places contain statements such as, "Go and make disciples of all nations," for which the most common interpretation is that the Christian should go and try to convert as many people as possible, if not ideally everyone on earth, to their religion. This is the basis of evangelism, what I sometimes call conversion ideology, or proselytizing. There's a word which can help us understand Christian evangelism, which certainly is historically, culturally, and ethically as well as politically relevant. And that word is one you might not expect, which is meme. M-E-M-E. The word meme was coined in the 1970s in a book called The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. And a meme is supposed to serve as the memory or mental equivalent to a gene. A gene is a trait that is passed down within a population. A meme is an idea that is spread from mind to mind, also within a population. We talk about memes as cute pictures on the internet. A cat with the caption that says, "Icon has cheeseburger." Or a cat playing the piano. Lots of them involve cats. But the word meme refers to far more than that. College is a meme. It's an idea that's passed around within a society. Books are memes. They themselves are an idea, and they contain an idea. The English language is a meme. Philosophy and ethics are memes. And religion, each religion individually, is a meme. Christianity is a meme that is especially viral. It is well adept at spreading itself. The mechanism by which it spreads is not cuteness per se, but particularly evangelism. This religion explicitly encourages its followers. Go and convert others. That's a very successful strategy for an idea to propagate. Now, perhaps that is the right understanding of this verse. Go and convert the non-believers and the infidels to the right religion. But perhaps being a disciple has more to do with following in the footsteps of Christ, which, as I had just argued, likely would refer to being loving and forgiving. Teaching the world to be loving and forgiving has considerable benefits. Encouraging all of humanity to join one and only one religion perhaps is appropriate, but in the context of a multicultural human species, is fraught with problems. How do we deal with or resolve those problems? That I'll have to leave to you. One of the most striking features of Jesus's philosophy is its nonviolence. What we had called, in a number of other traditions, ahimsa. It's worth emphasizing that when they come to kill Jesus, he lets them. This is radical self-denial, asceticism, and instead of Jesus pulling out his machine gun like Rambo and holding out in a fortress when they come to kill him, Jesus goes willingly to his own death. For this reason, I find it's ironic that in American Christian culture, there's such a considerable overlap with our gun culture. How does turn the other cheek and blow a hole in your enemy go together? That's a paradox. But it's not the point of this discussion, especially. Jesus speaks often in the New Testament of the kingdom of God. Jesus speaks at considerable length in the New Testament about the kingdom of God. The traditional interpretation is that this is something that will come later in time, something to be achieved in the future. And as the ideas develop through history, a heavenly kingdom or a supernatural realm. While it's possible that that is the correct interpretation, there is another possibility, which is that the kingdom of God might not be something separate, but instead, what happens when people are Christian to one another, in the sense of being loving and forgiving, practicing the ethic of Jesus, that wherever two or more are gathered in my name, there I am, he says. We see a similar monism instead of dualism when Jesus is on the cross with the two thieves. One, called the good thief, tells the other not to chastise Jesus. And Jesus responds to the man with the well-known phrase, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Again, the dominant interpretation is that this paradise is separate from the world. That the man is about to die, but because of his good faith, will be united with Jesus in heaven. However, if you were Christian, imagine being in the presence of Jesus, Lord of all creation, that it might indeed be that even hanging on the cross, dying out his last breath, to be in the presence of Jesus would already be paradise. That perhaps when you look at the text of the New Testament and the recorded sayings of Jesus, perhaps it is the case that the kingdom of God, paradise, and hell are separate dimensions from this world. Or perhaps they are realities we manifest through our actions. That paradise in the kingdom of God is what happens when people are Christian, loving and forgiving. and hell or damnation when people are the opposite, not loving and fail to forgive. There are two places, especially in this world, that I think are accurately described as hellish, and many of my students confirm this. The battlefield in a war zone is certainly not a place of love and forgiveness, and likely is as close to a hellscape as you will find. But also, to a large extent, our prisons are hellish. They're not places of love and forgiveness. And so, to a great extent, they do mirror or parallel the vision of hell that our culture is most accustomed to. But none of this is what's most relevant. Whenever I was preparing these lectures, I wanted to try and figure out what is important philosophically about Jesus. What metaphysic, epistemology, ethic, and politic does he provide? And in doing some scholarly research, what I discovered is that scholars of the New Testament argue that the book of Mark was likely the first gospel to have been written, for various reasons, and that all of the other gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John, appear, with scholarly analysis, to be based on Mark. So I thought, if we are to understand Jesus' philosophy originally, we should go to the most original source. That led me to Mark, in which I saw a number of the things we've already discussed. Jesus as lawbreaker instead of legalist. Jesus speaking about the kingdom of God in characteristic riddle or parable-like form. Jesus commanding peace. We see Jesus discussing what he calls the most important commandment, which is not, as we sometimes mistakenly think, to love the neighbor as thyself, but instead that God is one. While many interpret this as being a preview of the idea of the Trinity, that there is one God in three persons, those ideas will develop in more explicit detail later. The other interpretation, which is common, is that there's only one true God, and all others are false. Certainly that is possible. But again, Jesus is a mystic, and perhaps also a monist. I used the term monism a few moments ago to describe the idea that we had discussed in Hinduism's Advaita Vedanta. which was the idea that the divine realm, or the supernatural realm, and the physical realm are not separate, but one and the same. We had just discussed that idea with the kingdom of God, paradise, damnation, and the earth. That perhaps they're not two separate realms of existence or reality. The metaphysic is not one of dualism, but instead, it's all one and the same. After all, Jesus is claiming to be God, to be one with God. Perhaps he means he alone is. But for many later monists, especially in the Renaissance in Europe, as well as at least one Islamic Sufi mystic, which we'll see in the next video, oneness with God is something we all have. Socrates expressed this too. God speaks through me. And he, like Jesus, is executed for his arrogance in that way. Perhaps, though, even beyond Jesus meaning he is at one with God, and perhaps even that we are all at one with God. We are all the children of God. Perhaps, in a mystical, monistic sense, what Jesus means is that there is only one God, called by many names, by many peoples around the world. If that were Jesus' meaning, we would not have Christianity as an exclusive or absolutist religion. Meaning that Christianity wouldn't be the only one true religion. But instead, that all religions have truth within them. Or, as the common saying goes, all roads lead to Rome. Jesus is tricky to understand, and you're certainly welcome to argue that I am misinterpreting or even putting words in his mouth. But it's worth reconsidering whether or not it's likely that we have the end-all, be-all, right and final understanding of what Jesus is expressing. Philosophically, ethically, metaphysically, and politically. The book of Mark ends with chapter 16. In verse 1, what we see is there are three women: Mary, mother of Mary, mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of James, or Mary, mother of Jesus? Oh, now I'm confused. You can go find it. And Salome. Three women on their way to the tomb to wash Jesus' body, assuming that he had died and stayed dead. And what the verses say is that when they get to the tomb, they see the stone is rolled away, and there's a young man dressed in a white robe. This young man does not seem to be an angel. The Bible is well versed at dealing with angels. It knows how to talk about those. This doesn't say an angel, though it could have been one in disguise. It says a young man dressed in white, the sort of garb we had previously identified in the Chronicles of Josephus as being a member of this Essene cult. The young man says, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is risen. He's not here. But go into Galilee, there you will see him." The women left, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And then we have, in a number of translations of the New Testament, a set of brackets. And the brackets identify that the earliest manuscripts, as well as some other ancient witnesses, do not have the verses that follow after that, verses 9 through 20. That seems strange. I wonder what occurs in verses 9 through 20. In verses 9 through 20, Jesus gets up, shows himself to people, and talks to people. And then tells his followers to convert everyone to his new religion, and that they'll have miraculous powers if they do so. And then he ascended into heaven. What we see then is that, according to the text of the New Testament itself, it appears that the earliest version of the Jesus story ends with an empty tomb, and the requirement that one would just have to have faith. Jesus is not here. He has risen from the dead. Have faith. It's hard to have that kind of blind faith. And so, it makes sense that there might be some incentive to leave it not there on that uncertain cliffhanger of blind faith, but instead to finish up with, "And then he went around and showed himself to people." That's much more convincing. It's a better ending in narrative terms. And the part about going and converting people is certainly very effective at spreading this new religion. And it does spread like wildfire. We also see the origin of a practice that comes down to us to today, what's called faith healing. And this is not abstract or irrelevant or unnecessary. This turns into a question of social and political ethics. Because every year there's a handful of people who, motivated by these literal interpretations of ancient sacred texts, pray for their children instead of taking them to doctors, with disastrous results. Not only is it relevant to understand the epistemology and epistemological questions that the New Testament encourages or inspires. Did this really happen? What really went on that day? What's the right interpretation? But these are also contemporary life and death issues. And so, if we want to make sense of what is right to do today, we need to deal with how the ideas have progressed down through history. Jesus' execution is interpreted as fulfilling the blood debt requirement for human sacrifice in the place of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, which was aborted. Abraham didn't have to kill his own son as a blood sacrifice to the god. But the Christian interpretation is that Jesus does have to fulfill that blood debt obligation to appease God. This act is memorialized in churches around the world on a regular basis through the practice of communion, or the taking of the Eucharist. One of the things that philosophy can do is allow us to step outside of what is familiar and view it anew and fresh, with an outsider's perspective, to come to what is common to us with new eyes and fresh eyes. The practice of communion is a memorialization of human sacrifice. It's not just the ancient Aztecs who valorized human sacrifice. It's us too. Jesus is a human sacrifice as both man and divine God. And the practice of drinking the wine, symbolic for his blood, eating the wafer, symbolic for his flesh, through what is called the doctrine of transubstantiation, is not interpreted to be symbolic, but instead the literal flesh and blood of the slain human and God sacrifice. This is, if it had been in any other culture, symbolic cannibalism and a blood ritual. We don't think of it that way because it's normal to us. But we would be hard-pressed to identify it as anything other than that. That's not to disparage it, but instead to understand this practice. One way or another, after the conversion of the Roman Empire and Europe to Christianity, the Dark Ages fall. That might be coincidental, and it could be causal. The European world is significantly scientifically, intellectually, as well as culturally stunted for a millennium and a half. The significant inventions during this period of time are the stirrup, military technology, which makes knights more effective at mounted combat. The part that is being cut off by your screen is also feudalism. Feudalism is the idea of the divine right of kings. The political inspiration motivated by religion is that for the feudal lords of Dark Age and medieval Europe, if I'm king, it's because God made me king and wants me to be king. And if you're a peasant, it's because God made you a peasant and wants you to be a peasant. So you have to listen to me and do what I say, peasant. This form of theocracy or political society is incredibly repressive And the Renaissance will develop, along with its political ideas, which inspire our nation's democratic ideals in response to medieval and Dark Age feudalism. The idea that God picks and chooses political rulers and leaders is certainly still with us. In the most recent presidential election, many people claimed that God wanted them to be president. This idea hangs on even today, rightly or wrongly, appropriately or inappropriately. It has an ancient history. But as we wrap this up, our next video will deal with the rise of Islam, a religion which is incredibly important for understanding ethics and politics in our world today. And without Islam, the Renaissance likely never could have happened in Europe. When Europe had stagnated, Islam was in a golden age. And so, next we'll study Islam, both for its own relevance, its influence on cultural development, as well as scientific development, which gives birth to the European Renaissance, with which the Renaissance could not have happened without. And so that way we can make sense of the ethics and politics of the modern world, which I think we would all do well to spend some time in consideration of.